I kept my hands flat on the table the entire time my brother spoke. Not folded, not fidgeting, flat, like I was pressing something down. He stood at the head of the conference room in his Italian suit, the one our grandmother would have hated because she believed men who spent more on their clothes than their character had their priorities exactly backward, and he told the 12 board members, the company attorney, and 3 outside investors that I had been systematically draining the operating accounts of Aldridge Home Solutions for the better part of 2 years. He used the word systematically. He'd clearly practiced. I didn't look at him while he talked. I looked at the window. It was a gray Tuesday in late October, the kind of morning where the sky can't decide whether to rain or just stay threatening, and the oak trees along Commerce Street still had most of their leaves, brown and stubborn. I'd driven past those trees every morning for 6 years. I knew exactly which one had the split trunk from the ice storm in 2021. My name is Lena Aldridge. I'm 31 years old. My grandmother built this company with $40,000, a used cargo van, and a stubbornness that made most people uncomfortable. She left it to me. And my brother was standing in her conference room, in her building, telling people I was a thief. I did not flinch. You need to understand what kind of family I come from to understand why none of this surprised me. My grandmother, Ruth Aldridge, started this company when she was 54. Before that, she'd raised 3 kids, mostly alone, worked as an office manager for a flooring contractor for 22 years, and saved every dollar that wasn't already spoken for. She wasn't warm in the way people mean when they say that about older women. She was sharp. She remembered everything. She noticed what people did when they thought nobody was watching. She watched me. My father left when I was 7. My mother, Ruth's daughter, remarried twice, and both times moved somewhere new and brought me for a while before finding it easier not to. By the time I was 14, I was living with my grandmother full-time in her house in Claremont, Ohio. I did my homework at her kitchen table while she did the company books. She'd explain what she was doing if I asked. I always asked. My uncle had 2 sons, my cousins, and they visited on holidays in summers. The older one, Patrick, was fine, quiet. He became an electrician and moved to Portland, and we exchanged Christmas cards. The younger one was Garrett. Garrett was 3 years older than me and had understood from approximately age 12 that being charming was a skill that could substitute for most other skills if deployed correctly. He was good-looking in the kind of way that makes people forgive things faster than they should. He was funny when he wanted to be. He also had a habit of taking credit for things he hadn't done, which our grandmother noticed and which she mentioned to me once, quietly, when I was 17. That boy is going to spend his whole life trying to sit in chairs he hasn't earned, she said. She was rinsing dishes when she said it. She didn't look up. When she died 18 months ago, she left Aldridge Home Solutions, the business, the building, 60% of the outstanding shares to me. She left Garrett 12% and a cash sum she described in the will as more than generous given the circumstances. She left Patrick the same. Garrett did not take this well. He started making noise about it within a week of the funeral. I understood. Grief does strange things, and entitlement does stranger things, and when you combine them, the results are ugly. I gave him space. I kept running the company. We had 41 employees, contracts with 3 regional hotel chains, a new commercial laundry partnership we'd been building for 2 years, and a quarterly payroll of just under $900,000. I didn't have time to manage my cousin's feelings about a decision my grandmother made before she died. But Garrett had time. Garrett had a lot of time. He started calling the minority shareholders. He started having lunches with the outside investors. He hired an attorney, a man named Davis Fletcher, who had an office downtown and a reputation for aggressive tactics in small business disputes, and he began requesting documents, financial records, account statements, internal transfer logs. My company attorney told me in August. "He's building something," she said. "I don't know what yet, but he's building it." I told her to give him everything he asked for. She looked at me the way people look at you when they think you've misunderstood the severity of a situation. "Lena, if he finds something he can use." "Give him everything," I said again. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you know something I don't?" I thought about that question for longer than I showed. Then I said, "Let's just see what he builds." What he built was a presentation. He called a special board meeting for the last Tuesday in October, which required signatures from holders of at least 30% of outstanding shares. He'd gotten there by convincing two of the minority holders, a retired contractor named Bowen and a woman named Isla Pritchett, who'd invested early and never paid much attention since, to sign on. He submitted a formal agenda item, concerns regarding fiduciary conduct of current CEO. My attorney forwarded it to me on a Friday afternoon. I read it twice. Then I called a number I hadn't dialed in 11 months. The woman who answered had a voice like still water. She didn't say hello. She said, "I wondered when you'd check in." "Tuesday," I said. "I might need the letter." "I'll have it ready Monday." The conference room at Aldridge Home Solutions seated 16. My grandmother had chosen the table herself from an estate sale in 2009. Solid oak, slightly too large for the room, which she said was intentional. "You want people to feel like the work is bigger than they are," she told me. "Keeps them honest." I arrived first. I always arrived first. I set my notepad at the head of the table, got a cup of coffee from the corner machine, and stood at the window watching Commerce Street until people began filing in. Garrett arrived with Davis Fletcher, his attorney. Fletcher was in his 50s, silver-haired, with the particular ease of a man who had won enough rooms to stop worrying about losing them. He nodded at me when he came in, not warmly, professionally, the nod of a man acknowledging an opponent. The board members took their seats. The outside investors sat along the side wall. My attorney, a woman named Clara Osei, sat to my right. She had a yellow legal pad and a very still expression. Garrett stood and began. He was good, I'll say that. He had clearly spent real time on the presentation. There were slides, there were documents, there were account numbers and dates and transaction logs printed on paper and placed in front of every person at the table. He used words like irregularities and unauthorized disbursements and pattern of misconduct. He cited 4 specific transactions over an 18-month period totaling just over $230,000. He said these transfers originated from the company's operating account and landed in a private account he could not identify. He said with something in his voice I can only describe as rehearsed sorrow that he believed his cousin, that he believed I had been stealing from the company our grandmother built. He looked at me when he said it. I looked at the window, same gray sky, same stubborn oak trees. Davis Fletcher took over when Garrett sat down. He summarized the legal basis for removing a CEO in cases of alleged fiduciary breach under Ohio corporate law. He talked about the board's duty to shareholders. He was thorough and he was confident, and at one point he looked at me across the table and said, "Ms. Aldridge, I want to give you the opportunity to address these concerns directly. Can you provide this board with a clear accounting of those 4 transactions? Can you tell us where that money went?" The room was very quiet. I took a sip of my coffee. Then I looked at Clara. She reached into the leather bag beside her chair and placed a sealed envelope on the table. It was standard business size, plain white with a return address. I watched several people in the room squint to read. Office of the Special Inspector General, U.S. Department of Defense, Washington, D.C. She slid it down the table to Bowen, the contractor who'd signed Garrett's petition. He looked at it. He looked at me. He passed it to the next person without opening it. Fletcher watched it travel around the table. Something shifted in his posture. Not much, just slightly. When the envelope reached the board member at the far end, a woman named Soto who'd been with the company since my grandmother's era, she looked at me and I nodded. She opened it. She read the single page inside. Then she set it on the table and folded her hands and looked at Garrett with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life. Here is what no one in that room knew about me except Clara and one other person. When I was 24, fresh out of Ohio State with an accounting degree and a minor in information systems, I applied for a position I saw listed on a federal jobs board. The listing was vague. The interview process was not. It took 4 months, 2 polygraphs, a background investigation that contacted people from my third grade class, and a final conversation in a Washington office with no name on the door. I took the position. I worked for a federal financial intelligence unit, the kind that doesn't hold press conferences for 5 years. We tracked money. Specifically, we tracked money that moved through legitimate businesses to fund things that weren't legitimate. I was good at it. I was very good at it, in the way that my grandmother had been good at knowing who was worth trusting. I had her instincts and a government database. I left when my grandmother got sick. She needed someone, and I was the someone, and I packed my apartment in Arlington, Virginia in 2 weekends and drove back to Claremont without telling most people where I was going. My supervisor, a woman I will call only by her first name, Sarah, shook my hand on my last day and said, "The door doesn't fully close for people like you, you know that." I said I understood. The 4 transactions Gareth had found, the $230,000 he presented as evidence of theft, were payments made through an authorized federal reimbursement protocol to a subsidiary account established at the unit's request when I rejoined a consulting engagement 14 months ago, a cold case financial investigation. The work I did from my kitchen table at midnight on encrypted equipment was not work I could describe in a company filing. Sarah's letter described it, in the careful, deliberate language of people who choose every word knowing it may one day be read in rooms like this one. Soto passed the letter to the person beside her. It moved back around the table, hand to hand, the room getting quieter with each pass. Fletcher asked to see it. Clara nodded, and he read it standing up, which I noticed because it was the first time he'd stood since his presentation. When he finished, he set it on the table very gently, like it was something that might break, and he did not look at Garrett. Garrett was looking at me. I looked back. For the first time that morning, I looked directly at him. He had our grandmother's nose, that strong, definite line that photographs well. He had his father's eyes, though, which were always slightly calculating. Right now, they were something else. Not calculating. Lost. He looked, honestly, like a man who'd walked into a building that turned out to be the wrong building and couldn't find the exit. Isla Pritchett, who'd signed his petition and hadn't paid much attention since the early years, spoke first. Her voice was thin and careful. "So the transfers were authorized by a federal agency?" "Yes," Clara said. "And Lena she's been doing work for the federal government while running the company?" "On a consulting basis. Classified, the work required a subsidiary account that was not identifiable to outside parties, including family members." Clara's voice was very even. "That was a condition of the engagement, not a choice." Fletcher cleared his throat. He was regrouping. You could see it, the small recalibrations of a skilled attorney adjusting to new ground. The question of whether the board was notified. "The Inspector General's letter addresses notification protocols," Clara said. "The relevant regulatory bodies were satisfied. What was not possible was disclosure to individuals who were not cleared." She paused. "That included Mr. Garrett Aldridge." Garrett stood up. I don't know exactly what he intended to do. He stood up and he put both hands on the table and he looked at me and he said, "You could have told me something, anything. I thought you were robbing us." The room was very still. I thought about my grandmother at her kitchen sink. That boy is going to spend his whole life sitting in chairs he hasn't earned. I thought about the 14 months of phone calls I hadn't taken, the emails I'd answered carefully and briefly, the times I'd sat in the same building knowing what I knew and saying nothing because I'd signed my name to a document that required me to say nothing. I thought about how grief makes people cruel sometimes, not because they're cruel people, but because they don't have anything else to do with how much something hurts. And then I said the thing I'd been carrying for 18 months. "You never asked me, Garrett. In a year and a half, you never once sat down and asked me what I'd been doing with my life. You assumed. You built an entire case out of assuming." I kept my voice quiet. Not cold, just quiet. "That's not my limitation, that's yours." The meeting adjourned 40 minutes later. Fletcher requested a private word with Clara before he left, and she obliged, professional as always. The board members filed out mostly in silence, some of them touching my arm on the way past, which I appreciated without fully registering. Bowen stopped at the door and turned back and said, "Ruth would have handled this same way. I mean that as a compliment." I nodded. Garrett didn't leave immediately. He stood by the window. My window, the one with the oak trees, with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, which made him look younger, more like the version of himself from summers at our grandmother's house when we were kids, and none of this had happened yet. I gathered my notes. I didn't rush. "What happens now?" he said finally. "That depends on you and your attorney. I mean, legally, to me." I thought about what I wanted to say, what I actually felt, which was complicated in the way that most true things are complicated when you've had time to really sit with them. "Filing a false fiduciary claim with the board of directors has consequences," I said. "What those consequences are, I haven't decided." He was quiet. "I'm not going to destroy you," I said. "That's not what I want. But I need you to understand something." I picked up my notepad and my coffee cup. "This company is mine, not because of a piece of paper. Because I sat at that kitchen table when we were kids and I asked questions and I paid attention and I came back when she needed me. I earned it." I watched toward the door. "Lena!" I stopped. "I'm sorry." His voice was low, not dramatic, just honest. Finally, in the way people are honest when they've run out of everything else. I didn't. I thought I was doing something right. I thought I was protecting something. I stood in the doorway for a moment. "I know," I said. "She would have told you that intentions don't balance the books, and she would have been right." I drove home in the dark. October dark comes early in Ohio, and the streets were quiet by the time I pulled into my driveway, the house my grandmother had left me along with the company, with the porch light on because I'd remembered to set the timer. I sat in the car for a little while before I went in. On the passenger seat was the copy of Sarah's letter that Clara had returned to me after the meeting. I didn't open it. I knew what it said. I'd read the draft before she sent it. In the careful way I read everything, looking for the thing between the words, the weight of what's chosen and what's left out. I picked up my phone and sent Sarah a text. "It's done. Thank you." She replied in under a minute, "Your grandmother would have enjoyed that." I sat with that for a while. Then I looked at the porch light and the front door, and the oak tree in the front yard that she planted in 1987 and that was now taller than the house. I thought about sitting at her kitchen table when I was 14 with nowhere else to go, learning to read numbers the way other people learn to read people. She'd taught me both, really. She'd just used numbers to do it. I got out of the car and went inside. The books were balanced. That was enough. I keep thinking about the oak tree my grandmother planted in 1987. She put it in the ground the same year she incorporated the company. Same year she decided that the rest of her life was going to look different from the first half. It was barely taller than she was when she planted it. By the time she died, it had grown past the roofline. She never rushed it. She just made sure the conditions were right, and then she let it do what it was going to do. I think about that tree when I think about what happened with my brother. There's a version of this story where I'm bitter, where I sit in that conference room and I feel the satisfaction of watching someone's carefully constructed attack fall apart in real time, and I call it justice, and I move on. And maybe there's some of that. I won't pretend otherwise, but the longer I sit with it, the more I think what actually happened had very little to do with the letter or the board meeting or any single moment that could be filmed and called a turning point. It had to do with choices that were made years before any of that. Quiet choices. The kind nobody claps for. My grandmother used to say that character is just behavior when you're tired and nobody's watching. She wasn't quoting anyone. That was just how she thought. She built a business on it. Not by being ruthless, but by being consistently honest about what things actually cost, what work actually required, what people actually were when the pressure came. She taught me to read numbers, yes, but underneath that she was teaching me something older, that reality doesn't negotiate. What you put in is what you build. What you cut corners on will show up later. one way or another. Garrett cut corners on understanding. He saw a mystery and decided it was a crime because a crime was easier to explain than a life he hadn't bothered to know. That's not malice exactly. It's something smaller and sadder. A failure of curiosity, a refusal to sit with not knowing long enough to find out the truth. And it cost him more than the board meeting. It cost him 2 years that could have been something else between us. What kept me steady through all of it wasn't the letter in that envelope. I want to be clear about that. The letter was just paper. What kept me steady was that I knew what I had actually done. I had gone back when my grandmother needed me. I had worked through nights on things I couldn't explain to anyone. I had kept showing up, to the company, to the consulting work, to the choices that were hard without being visible. There's a kind of strength that doesn't come from being seen doing the right thing. It comes from doing it anyway, in the quiet because it's the right thing, and not for any other reason. That's what I want to carry forward, not the win, the practice. Because the tree doesn't know it's taller than the house. It just kept growing.